We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Hi, everybody. I'm your host today for the Energy Impact Podcast. I'm Adam Zuckerman, and today we're joined by a fantastic guest, Kyle Harrison, who is the head of sustainability research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Kyle, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, Adam, thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
Now, Bloomberg LP, it's a privately held financial software data and media company. It's headquartered in Midtown Manhattan in New York City. There's 170 odd locations, give or take, and almost 20,000 employees. Now, where does BloombergNEF sit in that organization?
Yeah, so we sit within the editorial and research group, and BNEF specifically, for those of you listeners that aren't familiar, we are basically the market research arm of Bloomberg LP, and we're focused on the transition to the low carbon economy. So actually, 2009, I believe it was, Bloomberg went ahead and acquired New Energy Finance at the time, thinking that there was going to be a global carbon market. And that obviously never materialized, but it's actually funny to see that nowadays kind of carbon's back in the spotlight. But at the same time, BNEF has kind of expanded its remit so much to look at sustainability, transport like electric vehicles, but also areas like digital industry and advanced materials.
Mm-hmm. So it's clean energy, advanced transport, digital industry, innovative materials, commodities. You've been at Bloomberg for 7+ years. Earlier this year, your team published a report. It's the 1H 2021 Corporate Energy Market Outlook. What is this report and why is it important?
Yeah, so we started noticing, especially in the United States a couple of years ago, that utilities were no longer the biggest driver of clean energy build in the country. What you started to see was more and more private sector companies where energy is not the core component of their business, going out and basically setting really ambitious sustainability goals. And the most effective way for them to go ahead and offset a lot of those emissions is to buy clean energy. And basically this power purchase agreement mechanism that utilities were using was kind of basically augmented to fit a corporate buyer's load profile. So over the years, we've started to see more and more corporations signing these contracts. And basically it's expanded from just the Amazons and the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, to smaller brand names and companies that a lot of us have never even heard of. And that's also expanded beyond the United States. So it's not just companies signing these deals, the typical virtual PPA model, as we call it, in the US. They're now signing innovative deals with utilities, installing on-site generation at a large scale, and also using hedging mechanisms in a much more innovative way. And that's happening globally, so not just in the US anymore.
What's the impetus for them to follow through with these programs of sustainability? Is it being mandated by governments? Is it just what they think the consumer wants and it makes their product and their brand more attractive? Why are companies doing this if it may possibly cost them more money?
Yeah, so it's really a combination of all the above. So if you look at a market, for example, if you look at companies in Europe, you now have the EU taxonomy that's being worked on, and that's basically going to mandate that certain companies report on the risks and opportunities to their business as a result of climate change. So part of it is government driven, part of it is consumer driven. And first of all, we would bake all of these things into a general term that we call transition risk. So if you think about it from the standpoint of an oil company, if I'm an investor and I'm looking at an oil company that I own, and they're increasingly facing regulatory pressure to decarbonize, consumer demand for oil products is going down. And at the same time, just the general perception of how an oil company operates is changing. All of those things are risks to the bottom line of a large oil company like that. So kind of it's a bunch of different pressures from all these different areas that are causing corporations to think a lot more about how they decarbonize. But again, thinking about it from a risk mitigation standpoint, but also from a opportunity creation standpoint as well, right? So the strongest companies that have gone through this low carbon transition, what they're doing is they're creating new products, unlocking new customers and new revenue streams as they decarbonize. They're killing two birds with one stone, and that's kind of the mindset that a lot more companies need to get into in this area.
All right, so you say a lot more companies need to get into it. Before we focus on that, can you define what clean energy is? Because there are several terms out there, like clean coal, for example. Would that qualify for objectives, or is there a different taxonomy that is widely accepted?
So when we think of clean energy in terms of something like the corporate energy market outlook, what we generally think about is anything that's zero carbon. So something like small hydro, for example, nuclear, but more prominently solar and wind and the occasional geothermal deal. I would say if you look at all the corporate clean energy transactions around the world, 95% or even more are for solar and wind deals. That's just the most prominent way that the companies buy clean energy. But you do see the occasional geothermal deal and some of these other zero carbon transactions, especially as the Googles of the world and the Microsofts start to look at what they call 24/7 renewable energy, which is that they need something that generates power consistently throughout the day, which is something that you can't rely on with a solar or wind project.
So explain that. So if it's not a base load type energy, which is always on, it's intermittent, why does that matter for a company? How does that impact them?
Right. So if you think about it from the standpoint of, we can use the example of Google again or Amazon. These are companies with large data centers. It's where the majority of their electricity consumption is coming from. And those data centers run at all times because, we're using the internet, we're talking on Zoom right now. And when we're not talking on Zoom, there's going to be people in other parts of the world that are. So they need that consistent, reliable electricity generation over the course of the day. A solar project only generates when the sun shines. A wind project only generates when the wind blows. And as a result, you can't really rely on the physical electrons that are coming from a renewable energy project as a corporation in order to keep the lights on over the course of the day. Of course, there are technologies that you can use to make this better, something like a battery, for example, but energy storage is not yet at a stage where you can deploy it at a large enough scale to capture all the solar and wind that's needed to kind of spread it out over the course of the day. So that's why a lot of corporations have broadened their definition of buying clean energy to all things zero carbon. When you start to look at this on an hourly basis and actually start to match things on an hourly basis, you need things that are going to generate on the shoulder hours of the day or at nighttime when the sun's not shining or when the wind's not blowing. And that's where something like geothermal or nuclear can come into play.
Are companies focusing only on specific locations, or are they trying to aggregate data across? So if you're a multinational conglomerate, when the sun is no longer shining in Spain, if you have operations in Brazil, for example, maybe it is, can you offset one to the other, or can you not offset across international boundaries?
So on paper, for any of the greenhouse gas reporting initiatives, for all the sustainability initiatives out there, like the RE100, the way you just described is a valid method of meeting a sustainability goal. So a lot of corporations, what they'll do is they will tally up their electricity consumption over the course of the year, and then basically they'll net that out against the renewable electricity production from their clean energy deals. And basically, if those net out over the course of the year, they're 100% renewable. Whatever that percentage is what they'll report. But increasingly, a lot of companies are starting to think that this is not a viable way of decarbonizing the grid. If all of my operations are located in New York, but I'm just adding more zero marginal cost wind to an already saturated, for example, Texas renewables market, am I really decarbonizing? Am I really combating climate change? So companies are starting to think about this with a bit more scrutiny. And they're starting to look much more locally at buying clean energy where they have operations, but then again, taking it a step further and looking at it on an hourly basis and saying, well, I can sign that wind deal, but that wind project in Texas might only generate at nighttime when the wind is stronger. What about in the middle of the day when most of my operations are running? this is not a viable means of meeting a clean energy goal. I need to look at an alternative or combine technologies to go ahead and meet that load profile.
And this is the type of information that goes into the report that you all have created. Can you give us a little bit of information about the report itself? How long is it? What does it focus on? Where are your data sources? How often it's released? And most importantly, for our listeners around the world, where can people access it?
Yeah, so it's a beast of a report. We put it out semi-annually, so typically around January and August every year, we'll publish the latest iteration of the report. And basically it has two kind of angles to it. There's a bottom-up kind of view of all the corporate clean energy procurement activity that has happened around the world. Most of that is happening through PPAs. That's the easiest mechanism that we can quantify. And what I mean by PPA is that a corporation will lock into a long-term fixed price contract for clean energy. But under that deal, they're not actually getting physical ownership of the power. The power is just getting sold into the market where that project is located. And again, this absolves companies of all that intermittency risk that we were just talking about. And as a result, it's the most popular way that companies are doing this. But there is this whole other universe of potential contracting mechanisms that will also track in this market outlook. So we'll look at innovative deals where you'll work with a utility. We'll look at on-site generation, so just putting rooftop solar at your facilities. But then we'll also look at it from a policy and economics lens as well. So generally, the market outlook does a deep dive into 15 or 20 countries around the world, and basically says, there's this policy change that happened over the past couple of months. As a result of that, you might see more or less corporate clean energy procurement activity. Here's why. And here's how it's going to impact the economics. And that's really beneficial from a corporate buyer standpoint, because they can get an understanding of, we set a clean energy goal, where can we go out and sign those deals? But it's also a goldmine of information for investors and developers that want to understand their customers better.
Now, let's talk about that for a bit. So despite the pandemic, the report says the global PPA market grew by 18% in 2020. And through 2020, corporations announced contracts to purchase 23.7 gigawatts of clean energy globally. Who are these individuals in companies that are managing that process? Are there specific energy buyers? Is it go under a sustainability group? And is there a community where these people get together and help each other understand this rapidly emerging marketplace?
Yeah, and I should add, it's actually now up to 25 gigawatts. So we've had some retroactive deals come in. So that growth figure is even higher, actually, which is just even more of a testament of how fast the space is growing, right? So it varies between companies. A lot of companies, they now have sustainability teams that are built out and have the ability to go out and sign these clean energy deals. But even with the sustainability team, signing one of these contracts requires so much internal coordination between departments. So even if you have that central sustainability team, they're going ahead and they're working with accounting, because this is a separate line item on your balance sheet. And a lot of times it's a hedging agreement, which requires special types of accounting. You need to go ahead and work with your treasury department. You need to work with your facilities team to get an understanding of how much electricity are we actually consuming. And of course, then there's the real estate operations side of it as well. So these deals can be quite complicated, and even with that centralized group, they can drag in a lot of different people. That is, to your point, Adam, there is that benefit as well of leaning on the expertise of other companies that have done this before. So there might be that company that has 3 people on their sustainability team, but they can lean on the expertise of, again, those big tech companies that have potentially 20 to 30 people specifically focused on buying clean energy. So there has become quite a tight-knit community for clean energy buying, especially in the US and Europe, where a lot of corporations meet a couple of times a year, typically in person. Hopefully we'll get back to that soon, of course. And they'll basically share best practices, and they'll also work with developers and basically determine what is the best project for my company. And of course, there's also a community that we're building within BloombergNEF as well, right? So we have a lot of clients on the utility side and the developer side, but of course also on the corporate sustainability side. And we want to help match those companies, but also use our platforms and events like our New York Summit and our London Summit as venues for these different parties to go ahead and mingle and share best practices.
Well, let's talk about that then. So as companies are evaluating potential PPAs, and we'll talk about all the different variations of it in a bit, what are some of the trends that you've seen in terms of duration, in terms of price? What are the factors that impact that? Is it matter if it's base load versus intermittent? So if somebody was to develop a nuclear facility versus wind, solar, or hydro?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of individual nuances that go into deals. By and large, I would say that corporate PPAs, and the beauty of a PPA and the reason why it was created in the first place is it allows a developer to secure financing for their project. So basically, a developer can say, I've got this company with a AAA credit rating. They're going to be paying me X amount for clean energy for the next 20 years, finance my project, right? And it's a lot easier to go ahead and make that case. The challenge, though, is corporations increasingly want shorter and shorter term lengths. And this has become the case as you have more risk-averse buyers entering this market. So as I mentioned in the beginning, you now have this kind of second generation of smaller companies, many of whom we don't even know about, right? These are companies that some of them I've never heard of that are signing these deals, and they really don't have the flexibility to maybe get that first deal wrong, right? They need to make it count on the first try. And as a result, they want to go ahead and basically cover their bases. And one of the ways to do that is not locking into a potentially 20-year or 30-year deal for an intermittent source of generation. So increasingly, we've seen the term length for clean energy contracts go down over time. But there's a middle ground, right? Because a developer still needs a certain amount of years in order to secure that financing. So generally, a corporate PPA is in that 12 to 15-year range now. If you go ahead and you work with a utility or a retailer as a middleman, those deals can get even shorter because the utility can actually take on all the risk from that longer term contract and then offer the corporate customer a shorter term deal. So that's one of the major factors. The other one is the settlement of the contract. So if a corporation signs a PPA, typically that deal is settled at the hub. And what that means is that the power gets sold into the wholesale market and captures the hub price at that time. And what that means is that the developer bears what we call basis risk. And that's the difference between selling into the node, which is basically a smaller kind of subsegment of a wholesale power market. So they, instead of capturing that price, they're actually capturing the hub price. And that difference between the two is actually a risk that the developer bears. So that's another kind of key defining trait of a corporate deal. And then the last one I would say, and I mentioned this hedging and risk mitigation angle. There's also the challenge of, what if power prices are really high in the middle of the day, but my wind project is not generating? That's a huge missed financial opportunity as a corporate customer. How can I go ahead and reconcile this? They refer to this risk as weather risk, right? So making sure that the generation profile of a clean energy project lines up with the load profile or the price profile in a wholesale market. And typically under a corporate PPA, a lot of them now have kind of a third-party add-on where basically you can go ahead and partner with a reinsurance provider or a bank, and they'll take on that risk themselves off of the hands of the corporate buyer for an added $1 per megawatt hour fee or something along those lines. So as a corporate customer, I might be paying a little bit more for my clean energy, but I get more certainty into it. And if I'm trying to convince my CFO to sign a long-term deal, it's a lot easier to do that if I can tell them exactly how much money they're going to be spending over that time period.
So let's walk through that process a little bit. In the course of different segments of that process, you'd say that the first stage is the match. So a developer has to meet with a company that's interested. Then there's the negotiation. So they say, based on this is what we want to do. Is it a letter of an intent or a PPA is actually signed with contingencies? After that is signed, the project becomes bankable. And once it's bankable, you can get financing, which means you go out to the market as the developer, you get financing, you then develop the project, and hopefully everything goes to plan, and you start delivering electrons to the grid or to the company that has engaged with you in the process. Now, for that, let's take each individual step. How do companies find developers and vice versa? Are there tender offers? Is there an open market? Because with so many different companies that are pursuing this, it seems like it's almost a Wild West.
Yeah, it definitely is. And honestly, the method that we currently use is not scalable, right? So if you think about all the companies that have clean energy goals and the amount of clean energy they'll need to buy, what we're doing today is not scalable. In our market outlook, we actually forecast clean electricity demand for the RE100 companies. So it's those companies that have set a 100% clean energy goal.
So you've used that term twice now, just for the listeners so they understand. Can you define RE100?
Sure. So it stands for Renewable Energy 100. Basically, when a company joins the RE100, which is in a company-led initiative, they will basically say that at a certain time, at a certain year, at some point in the future, they will offset 100% of their electricity consumption with clean energy on an annual basis. The beauty of that is we get a contained group of companies. We know what their target years are. So if they disclose that type of information, we can do a pretty accurate exercise of how much more investment it's going to take for those companies to achieve their goals. And basically in our RE100 forecast, which comes in the market outlook, we estimate that for these companies to achieve their goals, they'll need to purchase over 90 additional gigawatts of solar and wind by 2030. That is a lot of power, right? That is not a small amount. That's going to require billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment.
So let's talk about that process. If I am, I don't know, let's say Kyle Co., and I'm a developer and you are a company on the RE100, what is that process for that additional match? Do they go to Bloomberg? Do they go to a broker? Do they just start emailing randomly? What does that process actually look like in literal sense?
Right. So a lot of times they'll just put out an RFP and say, we need to sign a solar wind deal. Sometimes the company knows where they want to sign that contract. Other times it's more region agnostic or technology agnostic. And then you have a bunch of companies that'll go ahead and submit bids to that RFP saying, we'll offer you this project at this price in this market. And then basically the next step is to kind of negotiate some of those nuances that we talked about before, like the term length and some of these other risk add-ons.
What about the duration? So I imagine that it would take a different amount of time to build in different locations for different technologies, for different sizes. Are companies only looking for, I need this to be able to deliver within 9 months? Or can a company say, I'm going to enter into a tender offer for something that won't deliver for 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think most of the time it's sooner rather than later. I have seen a few types of transactions where a company will basically announce a PPA. And granted, this is a little bit further on in the process, but they'll announce a PPA that won't effectively be active for several more years, well beyond the time that that project is commissioned. But those deals are kind of far and few between. Most of the time, a company has an idea of, we want this project to start generating sooner rather than later. And we need a project that basically is going to, kind of commence construction as soon as possible. So generally, there is kind of that timeline in mind. But a lot of those kind of nuances, I think, can be discussed later on, right? Once you've found that partner that you want to work with. But nonetheless, I mean, to my original point, that RFP process it can be quite cumbersome, right? And you do have these events, like I mentioned, where corporations will basically get in a room and then they'll have kind of a revolving door of different developers coming in and pitching projects to them. All of these things help the process out and they make it a bit easier for the corporate buyer. But at the rate that we're trying to get to hit these goals, this is just not a scalable methodology, right? So there's a couple of companies now that are going out there and they're trying to offer technological solutions to solving these challenges. One company that I mentioned is Level 10 Energy. And what they've basically done is they've created an online marketplace where they're hoping to more dynamically match corporate buyers with developers that meet the criteria of that corporate buyer. And then you avoid a lot of the paperwork and the actual physical in-person interaction that's required to sign these deals.
Are those platforms anonymous? So what if a developer doesn't want the corporation that they're talking to know who they are until they express interest? So is it a double match or how does that work?
That's a really good question. I'm not actually sure. I would imagine, though, given some of the secrecy that goes into press releases in this area and some of the other disclosure, I'm sure there is some type of, anonymous filter that you can add to these transactions. Okay. That's a really good point, though. And, if any of the folks at Level 10 are listening to this podcast, you've got a new idea there.
There you go.
The other kind of one last thing I want to mention on the contracting side, a couple years ago in the fall of 2019, Google announced that it had signed roughly around 2 gigawatts of solar and wind deals all around the world. And they used kind of this new innovative contracting process to do that, where they basically went out and they specified all the parameters that they wanted in a clean energy deal in the markets that they wanted. And then there was basically a timed bidding process where any developer that was interested had to go ahead and bid as low as they possibly could to make the economics work over the period of about an hour. And then the winner who could offer the lowest price was the one who got to have that basically in-person discussion with Google, and they moved forward with the contracting.
That's fascinating. Now, unpack this for me. So Google goes online, it says, these are the specs. Kyle Co. competes. Congratulations, you're CEO again. And you have the most attractive package possible. Google says, come on in, let's talk. You haven't yet necessarily secured the land rights, gone through environmental permitting. How can you agree or say this is what we want to do before you've done that process? How does that operate?
Yeah, so there's definitely some kind of like early stage costs, operational costs that developers are willing to bear before they go ahead and secure that type of offtake, right? So a lot of times you can go ahead and purchase the land, get the rights to develop it. You can get the transmission permitting and all that stuff done first and foremost. And that's not too big of a cost on your balance sheet where basically if you don't find a corporate offtaker for a few months, you're screwed, right? It gives you that flexibility where you've kind of done the groundwork. You can go to a corporate customer and say, look, we've got that land purchased. We know exactly what we're going to do. We've got the project named already. Maybe you can change the name if you want to Kyle PV plant, but we've got all that figured out. Let's talk, a deal, right? So it's kind of that next step. And developers typically, that's kind of a little bit further on in the development pipeline. So they've taken all that stuff into account. I would say though, for a big enough corporation, for those AAA companies that a developer will, go completely out of their way to do business with, some of that stuff might be done first and foremost, that contract negotiation. Basically because, I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, Facebook, they were building a new data center and they were determining whether to build that data center in New Mexico or I believe Wyoming. And so basically you had two utilities, PNM Resources in New Mexico and Black Hills Corporation in Wyoming, basically bidding for Facebook's business. And the big factor there was, where can Facebook buy more clean energy at a more cost-effective, at a large scale?
So let's talk about that then. So price is clearly something that is extremely important on both sides of the equation. It is how profitable the generator will be. It is how cost-effective the buyer will be. Is pricing information with PPAs typically available? Is that something that you guys are tracking or other entities are tracking?
So we do have pricing. The short answer is it's not readily available at all. It's a very opaque market, and that's a huge challenge, right? That's a big issue with scaling up this market to the levels that we need. And I do know that companies like Level 10 are trying to bring a little bit more transparency there. But most of the time right now, the best way to figure out prices is to do developer surveys. So for example, in Europe, we put out a semi-annual corporate PPA pricing survey, where we'll go ahead and collect data from dozens of developers across Europe. And we'll basically get a range depending on a number of different parameters on what is a equitable PPA rate for a project. In the United States, go on, sorry.
No, please finish.
In the United States, it's a little bit harder to come by. If a company has a FERC registered subsidiary, so a subsidiary that is licensed to basically buy and sell power in wholesale markets as part of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they need to go ahead and report those transactions to FERC. FERC does not doesn't make your lives FERC doesn't make our lives any easier. These usually come in really complicated PDFs that we need to download and scrape and aggregate and all that. But you can effectively back out a price for a very tiny amount of entities that have those subsidiaries in the corporate world that are buying clean energy.
Okay. Have you seen any correlation between sustainability pledges and PPAs? Are sustainability pledges indicators of a desire to contract, or is there really a wide range of companies where some people are doing it, we're doing it without seeking publicity, and others say, no, we want to issue so everybody knows what we're doing?
Yeah, I would say the best indicator of future demand in this market, and the reason why we're so bullish on it long term, is because of all the corporate sustainability commitments that are out there, right? And it goes beyond just the RE100. So the sustainability initiative that has the most momentum is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And as part of this, a company will pledge to reduce their emissions in line with a well below 2 degree scenario, which is outlined in the Paris Agreement. buying clean energy is very much a viable strategy to achieving a science-based target. If you expand that out even further, you also have net zero goals. So basically taking that science-based target a step further and saying in 2040, we will effectively fully reduce or offset all of our CO2 emissions around the world, right? And net zero, I'm sure this is, for all the people listening to this, if you're in the sustainability sector, net zero is a word that you hear 1,000 times a day now, right? Every company is setting one of these goals. And then I'll broaden it out one step further and look at the supply chain as well. So a lot of these companies, a majority of their emissions are classified as scope 3. And what that means is that they come indirectly upstream from suppliers or downstream from the use of their products. And one of the most effective ways to reduce those emissions is to get your suppliers to buy clean energy and decarbonize. So if you look at a company like Apple, they've said, we want to get all of our suppliers to be 100% renewable. And the magnitude of getting all the Foxcons and the Pegatrons and the Taiwan Semiconductors of the world, getting them 100% renewable, that impact is so much greater than anything that Apple can do on its own, right? So when you kind of add in all these different tiers, it really does pave a very bullish outlook for clean energy procurement. And it is the strongest indicator that deals in this area are not going to dry up anytime soon.
Okay, let's talk about frameworks in which the corporate procurement operations take place in 1 second. Before we go there, let's stay on PPAs. Can you define and explain what a virtual PPA is and what an aggregated PPA is?
Sure. So again, if you think about a corporation that has a facility that needs 24/7 renewable power, you can't rely on that intermittent source of generation to go ahead and meet that goal. The way a virtual power purchase agreement works is that instead of taking physical ownership of that power that you buy as a corporation, that power is instead sold directly into the wholesale market, and it captures the spot price at that time. The way these deals work is that they're effectively financial or synthetic hedges, an additional line item on your balance sheet, where at the end of every month, the developer and the corporation and a broker, if there's a broker involved, will get together and say, here's how much this project made from the PPA. So you basically take the amount of generation that project had, and you multiply it by that fixed PPA price that a corporation has agreed to pay a developer for that generation. That's the revenue that project made under a PPA. Separately, you look at the amount of revenue that project made when it's sold into the wholesale market. So you take that same amount of generation, but instead of multiplying it by a fixed PPA price, you multiply it by the spot price that fluctuates over time that project captures. If that revenue from selling into the wholesale market is higher than the PPA revenue, the developer actually needs to go ahead and compensate the corporate customer the spread between those two prices. Conversely, if the revenue from that project is lower selling into the wholesale market than through a PPA, it's the corporation's responsibility to make that contract whole, right? Because they've signed an agreement and they said, we will pay you up to $35 a megawatt hour, let's say, for that clean power. And the project was only earning, say, 30 on the wholesale market. It's our responsibility to pay that extra $5 between those two and kind of reconcile that spread and make the contract whole.
Is that a way for corporations to avoid wheeling fees?
Part of it is certainly around wheeling fees, right? Because they're not taking physical ownership of the power. It's just going into the wholesale market. But really the most important thing here is that as a customer, I can continue to buy electricity, firm, reliable electricity from my utility, business as usual. And then I can still go ahead and meet a 100% clean energy goal with this financial contract completely on the side. There's certainly drawbacks to this. The biggest one is this phrase additionality. As a corporate customer, am I really driving new added decarbonization that wouldn't have happened by signing one of these deals? Depending on where you sign a contract and how much you pay and all these other factors, a lot of people would argue that a PPA is not a viable long-term sustainable strategy to meeting, to achieving a net zero world or a Paris-aligned world. But for right now, it's by far the most prominent mechanism that a company can use because, again, it absolves them of all that physical and operational risk that they would deal with from an intermittent source of generation.
Let's talk about aggregated PPAs then.
Yeah, so that's another area, and I think this goes back to your question, Adam, about smaller customers and smaller teams that don't have that expertise on buying clean energy. how can they rely on a more experienced company? The aggregated model, the way it works is typically, a lot of companies, they don't have the electricity demand to serve as the sole off-taker on a large solar or wind project, right? So if I'm a developer, again, we can go back to that scenario of, going to the bank and asking for a loan. If I can only tell the bank that I've got 20% of my project's output contracted, the bank's not going to, they're not going to write me a check, right? I need to have 70, 80, 90, 100% of that project's output contracted under a PPA or some other type of mechanism. So what that means is that it leaves kind of a lot of smaller corporate buyers in the dark where they can't sign one of those contracts because they can't offtake all that power. And no one's going to go ahead and buy significantly more power than they need unless they have some other, additional type of strategy they're trying to achieve. So the way an aggregated deal works is you'll have a bunch of buyers with smaller loads or a couple of smaller load buyers partnered with a larger corporate customer, which we would refer to as an anchor tenant, similar to what you would see in real estate, for example. And they'll approach a developer and say, individually, we only have this amount of electricity demand, but combined, we can contract for the output of 90% of this project. And as a result, that's, it's a win-win for the developer. They can go ahead and sign a deal with this aggregated party.
So there can be aggregated syndicates of buyers. And then on the flip side, if one large corporation, Google data center, Netherlands, for example, needed more energy than a single output could supply, they can engage with multiple PPAs from multiple different developers.
Exactly. And typically when we think of aggregation in this space, it's mostly from the buyer side. It's a buyer-led initiative. But you're absolutely right that a large corporation can partner with different developers, right? And there is strings attached to that. It means more contracts to negotiate. It means different risk profiles for different projects, right? And, there's the whole credit element to it as well. But, if you kind of think about it from the flip side, if I'm a corporate buyer and I'm one of those smaller off-takers, and I don't understand how this works from an accounting standpoint, I have a lower credit score. I'm not comfortable signing one of these large deals myself. Going in on a contract with a bunch of other experienced buyers is a phenomenal way to kind of leverage their expertise and kind of lean on them at the times when you need them.
There are so many different pieces that come into play here. So with aggregated buyers, you have multiple entities coming together to say, listen, we want to band together to buy one larger bulk nut, so to speak, from a developer. On the other hand, the developer saying, I want to lock in as much of my generation capacity as possible for as long as possible to make this project bankable. What if they can get 70% of their capacity generated contracted for, but it's only on a 10-year term when the lifetime of their facility is expected to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Can you still bank that project, or do you have to have a PPA for now and then have a lead on PPAs later?
Yeah, so the developers will look at it from a few different angles. One of the ways to do that is say, okay, maybe 10 years from now, I'll lock into another contract for the second half of this project's lifetime. However, there's a lot of companies that are totally comfortable with what we call going merchant, where they'll just sell their power into the wholesale market and capture that revenue. And of course, there's a huge risk element to this. If you look at a scenario like what we've seen in Texas in years past, where power prices reach negative, right? That's a nightmare for a developer that has a basically unlevered merchant project. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have times like right now, right, where it's extremely hot in Texas. Everyone's blaring their air conditioners, and demand for natural gas and power is through the roof, and power prices go up. That's a huge opportunity, on the other hand, for a developer with a merchant project. So a lot of companies will go merchant. You have an increasing number of companies that will sign hedging agreements, developers. So instead of signing a PPA with a corporate off-taker, I can go ahead and sign a proxy revenue swap or a proxy generation PPA or some other type of very complicated insurance product with a reinsurance company or a bank. And that could effectively serve as a proxy for a PPA and replace that PPA. And then, of course, the most traditional option, and I would say it's the gold standard if I'm a developer and I'm bringing a project to market, is I could just sign a PPA with a utility or a retailer. And that's always the most desirable because they'll sign a 25 or 30-year PPA. They're willing to settle that deal at a node rather than at a hub, and they'll take on all the intermittency and operational risk that comes with that project.
Okay, let's shift over to the procurement process for the individual companies. There are on-site generation, direct investment, corporate PPA, green tariff. This is table 5 in the report for people that have it in front of you and want to flip over. Why is this relevant? Why is this important?
It really, it depends on, there's so many factors that a company needs to think about when signing a clean energy deal. So for example, if I'm one of those smaller companies that was potentially going to look at an aggregated deal, but I don't have the electricity demand to do that, maybe I can meet all of my electricity demand with on-site generation. And of course, rooftop solar is something that's been around for decades now. And depending on where you're located, if there's a net metering policy or some other scheme where I can sell excess power back to my utility and get a credit on my bill, if those types of things exist, you can actually save a ton of money on these deals, right? And you can actually undercut your retail bill by a significant amount. So companies are constantly evaluating the different types of mechanisms that exist out there to buy clean energy. There's also, again, that phrase additionality that I mentioned before. How can I incentivize new added decarbonization that is always in the back of the minds of large corporate buyers? So if I were to go ahead and rank all these mechanisms by some of these factors, right? Each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. And that's why there's kind of such an elaborate taxonomy or table of different options. So on-site generation, it's additional. You're either owning or leasing that system. It's going right on your roof. You're physically consuming the power, and you can save a lot of money. But the challenge has always been scale with that, right? For all these large corporations that join the RE100 or set a science-based target, no amount of on-site generation is ever going to allow you to meet that goal, right? It's just too small. So that's always been the setback with on-site renewables. For scale, virtual PPAs are always the best way to do it, right? Because you have those examples of Google or even Total a couple of months ago, where they can buy several gigawatts of solar and wind in one fell swoop. Of course, it takes months and potentially years to negotiate, but you can buy a significant amount of power that you can never do with on-site generation. So when it comes to scale and meeting a large-scale target that potentially is imminent, virtual PPAs are the best way to do that.
Let's talk about that then. So companies like Google, large data centers, others may be picking up PPAs long-term in the gigawatt scale. If KyleCo wanted to place 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts for a 10-year PPA, how fast could you offload that?
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, right now, it's absolutely a seller's market. You have so many buyers that are out there that want to go ahead and sign deals. So if I'm a developer and I'm looking to contract for my project, chances are I can find a lot of willing takers to go ahead and sign that deal, both in the utility space, but also in the corporate space as well.
Okay. And lastly, we'll talk about the frameworks, which we mentioned earlier. There's a table, I believe it's number 4 for those that have the report in front of you. It talks about retail choice, RECs available, net metering, on-site PPA, off-site PPA. Can you explain a little bit what the retail choice and what RECs are and what net metering is?
Sure. Yeah. So if you kind of look at the different traits that go into clean energy buying, and each of those traits has their own benefits, right? If you think about something like certificates, every unit of clean energy generation that is out there, it becomes very difficult to kind of physically account for all those electrons. And that's why a certificate system around the world has been created to track each megawatt hour of clean energy generation. When, as a developer, if I'm KyleCo again, I keep forgetting if KyleCo is a corporate buyer or developer. I feel like
you're a developer at KyleCo.
Okay, gotcha. I feel like we keep switching here. Let's say KyleCo in this case is a developer, right? If I go ahead and generate power for my project, that power is going to come bundled with a certificate, meaning that certificate is going to come attached to that megawatt hour of generation. However, over time, if that power gets sold to, for example, the wholesale market, or it gets sold to a corporate customer, you can unbundle the certificate from the power. And as a corporate customer, I can go ahead and strictly buy unbundled certificates from a project to meet a sustainability goal. This has historically been the most popular way that a company can go ahead and achieve a clean energy goal. There's absolutely no risk to it. It is a sunk cost, but it's a fairly cheap one. So if I, for example, buy certificates in Texas or RECs, those can be, 50 cents a megawatt hour. They can be very, very affordable. So it's a very easy way to buy or offset a lot of my electricity demand at a large scale. But the challenge is that I can buy a certificate that was issued 10 years ago. So there's absolutely no additionality to it. No corporation can, with a straight face, buy certificates and say, I'm incentivizing new clean energy build that wouldn't have otherwise occurred, right? So that's always been the eternal setback of certificates. But nonetheless, for companies that need to meet an interim goal, or they want to kind of top off, maybe their PPAs generated up to 90% of their electricity consumption when it was supposed to be 100, maybe they'll top off that extra 10% with certificates. So it's still very popular in that regard. Some of the other mechanisms that you mentioned would be something like retail choice. This is a kind of an entirely different world that I've hinted at, over the course of this discussion, but never really dove into. But a lot of times you can work with a retailer or a utility who can offer you some type of special retail agreement where they'll guarantee that a certain percentage of it is renewable. So they'll say that, 40% of our portfolio is from solar and wind projects, but we'll go ahead and buy from the wholesale market an additional 20% to ensure you that at all times you're 60% renewable. And that might have an additional premium on top of it. In certain US states, I don't have the choice to do that. If I'm located in a regulated market, I have to buy electricity from the utility that exists in that market. In deregulated states, though, where there's retail choice, that gives me the option to evaluate all the potential retailers and utilities that have these types of programs and figure out which is the most cost effective and which is the best for me. And that's a huge benefit, right? A lot of markets around the world that have been fairly stagnant when it comes to clean energy buying, one of the biggest factors there is they don't have retail choice. But then the other one is that they don't have a certificate tracking mechanism. Unless you have those two factors, it's not a supportive environment for a corporation to go ahead and meet a clean energy goal.
So the final question for the day, Kyle, you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for the time. What's your outlook on the clean energy transition?
Yeah, so I said before, we're bullish. We are very bullish as a company. It's not just the sustainability world and corporate procurement. BNEF, every year, we do our new energy outlook. And for the BNEF subscribers that are listening to this, I think our latest new energy outlook is coming out in a few weeks, which is exciting. But in our previous one, we estimated that by 2050, based purely on economics, over 50% of the global electricity mix would come from solar or wind projects.
That's right? Fantastic to hear.
If you think about how many trillions of dollars of investment that's going to take to decarbonize the power system, it's impossible to not have a bullish outlook there, right? On the corporate standpoint, going back to all the sustainability commitments that companies are making, all of that is going to create significant amount of demand for clean energy. So we're very bullish there. Right now, we're pacing well ahead in corporate PPA volumes, where we are this year, ahead of where we were at the same point last year. So we are anticipating another record year as well there.
All right, Kyle Harrison, Head of Sustainability Research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. This is the Energy Impact Podcast. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Adam.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.